Hello and welcome to another digital wildlife walk with myself, Russell Headley, from Nature Talks and Walks. And this evening, on the 7th of April 2021, we're going to be talking all about the buntings of the UK, which is a brilliant group of birds to discuss. I will be honest, when I am asked about birds in the UK and what my favourite family is, I normally do say the buntings. They're not the most diverse group. There's not too many of them, but there's something about the look of them, which I'm sure you'll agree is very, very gorgeous and cute as well. So they have a lot of things that I look for in my wildlife. So here is the presentation itself. And we're going to jump into the full screen mode. There we go. So buntings, or bunting as it says there, bunting of, we only talk about one, guys, bunting of the UK. That should be buntings, of course, because there's more than one species. But that is a good point to talk about the word bunting, because this word, as other common words in the bird world, the flower world, they can get bandied around quite a lot between birds that aren't actually related to one another directly. And we'll be discussing that tonight, because some of the British buntings are not technically buntings, but we'll get into that as we go. We all know this by now. I don't think I need to do this anymore. But yeah, stopping your video helps with your quality. So if my voice drops off, if the quality dips, stop sharing your video. You're all muted so that you can all hear the presentation clearly. But if you want to unmute at the end to ask a question, it's at the bottom left. And as we go through, please feel free to put any questions or even just comments into the chat box. I cannot read the chat box as I'm presenting, but as soon as I stop, that's the first thing I go into to answer the questions. Okay, so as usual, when we look at a specific group of British nature, I always put it into a global context first, because the context is important with a lot of these species. Sometimes that's because in Britain, we classify them as near extinction or very, very rare. But when you look at a global picture, it turns out that they have quite a wide distribution and that they are anywhere but endangered. So it is good to keep this at the back of your mind. And what is the global picture that our British animals fit into? The buntings themselves come from the genus Emberiza, and it's the only, it only has one, it's the only genus within the family at all, so within its own family. And the global Emberiza species numbers 45 species, which in comparison to some of the other bird groups we've been looking at is not that great. It's not that numerous. And again, that's because a lot of the buntings have very wide-ranging living habitats, and some can be found across multiple continents being the same species. So that's one of the reasons why there are so few compared to other types of birds. So if we were to ask the question, well, if there's 45 buntings across the planet, how many do we have in the UK? And you might be able to count these in your head and come up with a number for what you think. And the answer is 4 brackets 5. Now, the brackets 5, I'm going to explain right at the end, but there are 4 definite Emberiza. I can never pronounce scientific names. There are 4 of them officially in the UK. And again, that means that although, you know, the diversity of buntings globally is lower, we have 10% of them in the UK. So that's pretty cool. And often buntings are quite colourful. You can see in the pictures, these are, I think that's the red-faced bunting in the top left. And they often have yellows and reds and stripes and all sorts of colours and patterns. And they also have, as you'll see in the rest of the slides, they have a special kind of beak formation. They've got almost like a type of tooth, it looks like. On the lower mandible, it's not flat as they open their beak. On the inside, there's a little nodule. And as they sing, you can often see this. So yeah, that's one thing to watch out for. The buntings are quite well adapted to living in a variety of habitats, sometimes within a single species. They can live everywhere from sea level to mountainous regions. They are very adaptable and have done very well across the world. Most of the buntings feed on a variety of food types, including seeds and insects, which is part of the reason they've been so successful, which is that they have not specialized into one or the other. They feed on both at different times of year. Primarily, the true buntings live throughout Eurasia, which is Europe and Asia, and Africa, stretching from Britain to Japan and down to Africa. And that is mainly where they live. Some of our British species have actually been introduced to other parts of the world. New Zealand, for example, has some of our buntings that shouldn't really be there, but are actually doing very well for themselves on the other side of the planet and on the southern hemisphere. And as I say, most buntings are omnivores and eat a very wide variety of plants, seeds, and small invertebrates, which aids them cope with a variety of habitats, geographies, and countries, and even continents as well. An interesting fact about them is that compared to finches, which have been domesticated into cages as songbirds, humans have in no way domesticated buntings. It's just one of those interesting things that buntings probably don't survive long enough in domestication to be domesticated fully. And they are difficult, or more difficult, I'll say, to breed in captivity than other birds such as finches. And therefore, when you see one, it's truly a special sight, because you can't just go down to a local exotic pet shop and find a bunting in a cage. So let's start going through the British species. And as you can see there are 4 species that I'm mainly focused on here. And the most obvious one is the reed bunting. Now, this is a gorgeous bird. This is the male reed bunting. You can identify him. He's about the size of a goldfinch or a great tit, you know, a small bird with a lovely black head and a white moustache coming down the sides of his beak. That's, of course, if you see them with a good view, maybe on a bird feeder in the garden. If you don't get that view, what you often see is that you see the tail. In proportion to the rest of the body, the reed bunting has a very long tail. And when it flies away from you, if you've startled it on a walk, you'll notice that the tail has a black inner color bordered with 2 white stripes. And these white stripes and black middle are very obvious. It's like a flag flying. And so if you see a bird fly away from you with that tail, you know it's a reed bunting. It can't be anything else. The habitat of the reed bunting, as you can imagine, is reed beds. However, the name is a little misleading here, because reed buntings can actually breed in a variety of habitats, as their cousin buntings can as well. This means that they will also breed in grassy sand dune systems by the coast, all the way to the gardens and hedgerows of suburbia. And at this time of year, you could expect to see a reed bunting on your bird feeder. I had a friend who lives in South Manchester, nowhere near a reed bed, have a reed bunting on her bird feeder just recently. And this is when you get a number of birds migrating around the country from their wintering homes to their breeding homes in reed bed systems. What a gorgeous bird, isn't it, when you see it? always very upright when they sing, and the beaks are quite chunky on the true buntings, with a black eye, a jet black eye. That's something that follows through in most of the birds we'll see. Unfortunately, the reed bunting is listed as an amber species, which means that in the traffic light system we use to assess the health of bird species, green being that they're at a good number in the wild and that their population is stable and that their population is at a level that is sustainable. Amber means that there has been a decline in population, and there's some worry about that there needs to be something done to turn that back around to get to green. And that red means that not only has there been a decline, but that they are still declining today quickly, and that means they need a lot more work to prevent local extinctions happening. So the reed bunting sits in the middle of these three categories. And in terms of how many there are in the UK, there are probably around 500,000 reed buntings, which make up 250,000 territories, breeding territories around the UK. The song of a reed bunting, which this male is singing here, is very important, as with all birds at this time of year, so that he can attract a mate and put off his enemies from entering his territory. The louder the song, the healthier the bird. And so he really tries to project his voice as far as he can. And luckily for us, he repeats the same thing over and over again. So if you can pick up these notes, you'll know it's a reed bunting. Now, hopefully you heard that on your speakers at home. If you didn't, just unmute yourself and just let me know, but I'm pretty sure you should have heard that. The reed bunting, for me, I remember what it says because I always put words or lyrics to the bird songs so that it fits in my head, really, I suppose. And I always imagine a reed bunting at a reed mace, a bulrush, you know, the thick sausages you see on the ends of sticks in marshes. And I imagine that bulrush is being used as a microphone and that the bird is saying 1, 2, 3, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. So that could help you. You could hear something completely different in that song, but as long as you can recognize the song, you'll get the bird. The nests are normally very low to the ground in the reed bed itself amongst the rushes, so they're normally pretty difficult to find. But notice the pattern on these eggs, which are quite remarkable. They're not just spots or even lines. They are squiggles all over the covering of the egg. No one's quite sure why each bird has a unique pattern, but one of the reasons could well be to do with the cuckoo, which is that the cuckoo tries to lay its eggs in nests like this one so that the reed bunting will raise its chick and not the cuckoo itself. Therefore, the bird is probably using that squiggle pattern to make sure that those eggs do belong to the reed bunting and they are not an interloping cuckoo instead. I should do a whole talk about cuckoos, to be honest, because they actually mimic the eggs themselves. But yeah, we'll go into that another time. So yes, these nests are vulnerable to predation from things like stoats, weasels, rats, mink as well, and even grass snakes if they can find them. And so they really don't want to keep the eggs and the chicks in there longer than a couple of weeks. Within a couple of weeks, you want the chicks out of there, fledged and flying around, because the longer they stay in the eggs, the more vulnerable they are. However, to help them, if the eggs are found by a predator, the adults will pretend to be injured. They'll drop a wing or drop a leg and start dragging it around as if they've got a broken bone. as to try and distract the predator, to make the predator go after the parent rather than the eggs. And just as the predator is about to attack the parent, they'll fly off because they were pretending all along. Second bunting then, after the reed bunting that I'll talk about, is the corn bunting. Now, this is our largest bunting, not by very much, I'll admit, but it's quite a chunky, small bird. It's bigger than a great tit, and as you can see, the neck is much thicker, so it's a much rounder bird all over. Again, jet black eye against the light-coloured brown of the feathers. This is a great example here of looking at that beak, and you can see that little nodule on the top and the bottom mandible, again suggesting to you that this is a bunting. If you saw this brown bird and thought, yeah, it's an LBJ, it's a little brown job, how am I going to identify it? Well, if you were to see that beak and those little nodules, that's bunting. Otherwise, it is a very thickly set bird, and the dark eye is a good indication as well. If you were to hear the bird, it would sound like this. So it's quite a tinny sounding call for my ears, and I'm pretty sure that it has been described to me in the past, because I remember it, as a run-up to a cricket ball. You know, when you run up to launch the cricket ball, or a bowls, you know, if you play bowls and you run up to launch the ball, it sounds like a bit of a run-up to something. It would be good to remember this call, because if you hear it, it's quite a good sign. Compared to the reed bunting, the corn bunting is a red-listed species, so its decline has been more severe and is still occurring today. Compared with the 250,000 breeding territories of reed buntings, there are estimated to only be 11,000 breeding territories of corn buntings. That's less than 10%. That's just less than 5% of the reed bunting population. So they are far, far lower in number. And they probably were at one point a much higher number, because they're a farmland bird. And again, as you can see in the picture, they will feed on both seeds and caterpillars and other insects at different times of year. There's no real reason why they should be going down. Their pure habit and ecology is one of coping with many different food types and habitats. But unfortunately, the way we manage our farmland to maximize food production over the past 70 years or so means that we use pesticides that don't only kill our pests, but any bug or insect that dares to tread in a human field. And it wipes the slate clean. And at the breeding time of year, these birds run out of food. Not only that, but their nests are made on the ground. And because of when we harvest our fields in the modern Britain, the tractors often go out at this time of year, just at the same time of year as the birds are laying their squiggly shelled eggs, and they of course get destroyed in the mess that follows. We don't necessarily have to do this, because before the Second World War, our tactics for making food were different, and there's growing pressure to change and actually reverse what we're doing in some ways, to go backwards, because that was better for wildlife, and wildlife makes us better at coping with our physical and, more importantly, our mental health. That, as you can tell, is where my wildlife trust job is starting to creep in. So I'm gonna keep talking about corn buntings. It can be characterized as well, if you see them, by having a fluttering flight. It's not like a clean-cut flight, it's a very quick flapping flight. And it tends to be that when they fly, they characteristically dangle their legs. below their bodies. They don't tuck them in, they keep their legs down. So that's another way you can look to identify them. And here's a nice picture just to show a side-by-side of a house sparrow, very common bird, or also declining, I must say, but very common still, next to a corn bunting. And you can see the difference in the beak. The beak is more of a rounded shape when it's shut compared to the triangular shape of a sparrow. And so you never know where you might see one. They have been widespread in the past. I've seen one on the south coast before now. They do appear in the north. If you're in farmland territory, you've just got to be lucky and listen out for them. And check the sparrow flocks. Check each bird within them, because you never know. Amongst them, there might be a corn bunting. And then, of course, there's the yellow hammer, which must be the most colourful bunting that we have in this country, I think, and may therefore be my favourite. The yellow hammer is again another bird of the farmland habitat, and the male, which is pictured here, is a bright yellow bird with black markings throughout. The beak is not as large, and indeed the bird itself is not as large as corn buntings. They are smaller, not by much, to be honest. I mean, if you saw them at the other end of the field and you had 5 seconds, I'm not sure you'd be able to, tell with any degree of certainty how big the bird was compared to each other. But they are just a bit smaller than corn buntings. They are also red listed, which means their numbers have been and are going down for much the same reasons as the corn buntings. But ironically, the population currently for yellowhammers is estimated at 700,000 territories, which just goes to show that it's always good to check the population after you see what listing it is. If it's red listed, the corn bunting is at 11,000, but then the yellowhammer, which is, however many times more than the corn bunting in population, is still red listed because it's declining in number. So it's always good to check the population. The males, as I say, are brightly colored. The females are not so brightly colored as the males, because when they're on the nests in the hedgerow, in the hedges, which is possibly the reason why they are doing better than corn buntings, they don't nest on the ground. They require the hedges that run along the sides of farmers' fields, and therefore can stay away from the tractors' tires that come out to dig up the ground in March and April at this time of year now. You can find this up and down the country as well. If you're in farmland, good farmland with good hedges. That's one of the problems for this bird, is that a lot of fields in the past 70 years again have been maximized for food, and every single meter has been turned into a crop producing land, and therefore a lot of hedges were ripped out to make room for crops, and that's where this bird breeds. So that's why hedging, is an important habitat. If you see a chance to plant a hedge as a volunteer, I would grab it, because hedges are brilliant habitats for birds like this one. And the yellowhammer is famous for its song, which many people quote as that the bird is saying on repeat, "Little bit of bread and cheese." I think that the quote is also sometimes "little bit of bread and no cheese" instead of just cheese. But you get the picture. If you hear the cheese at the end, or please, it could be whatever you want it to mean. It could be little bit of bread, please, little bit of bread and no cheese, please, whatever. You get the idea that you're listening out for that long last note. Interestingly, another local name for the yellowhammer in the past was the scribble lark. The reason for that is that the sound of the song is larkish. The size of the bird is actually larkish as well. And the eggs, just like the reed buntings, have lots of little scribbles, little scribbly lines all over them. And so that fact joined the bird in what we call it today. Now, the fourth bunting, which is found in the UK and breeds in the UK, which is possibly the least well known of our buntings, is the Searle bunting. The Searle bunting is one that has had a huge difference in terms of its success and its population. It has, over the past 30 years, been at rock bottom with very few Searle buntings left in the country. And since the 1970s and 80s, it has been steadily increasing in number, but only thanks to a very committed group of conservationists along places like the Devon coastal areas to bring it back. As you can imagine, therefore, that makes the Searle bunting a red-listed bird species. And it's estimated that there are only 1,000 territories of this bird currently in the UK. And so it is fairly on the edge of existence in the UK compared to its bunting relatives. The Searle bunting, if you were lucky enough to hear it, realistically, you're going to need to go to somewhere on the south coast on a very warm, coastal area with hedgerow and gorse and heather. That's the kind of habitat that you would go to see this bird with a beautiful mixture on its face of yellow and black stripes. None of the other buntings in this country really have anything quite like this. But if you go to Europe, a lot of continental buntings have this striping through the face in one way or another. But yeah, if you were looking out for your buntings and listening out for them, you're listening out for this song. So that kind of machine gun drilling sound is the territory call of the Searle bunting. And that's what you're listening out for to prove that you're listening correctly to one of these birds. As I say, if you're interested in this story, it's well worth researching properly what the bird has gone through in the last few years. I think it was RSPB at the Labrador Bay Nature Reserve, where it was down to some of their staff, and it's thanks to their work that the bunting has recovered as it has, because in order for it to recover, the farmland in the area around nature reserves had to be managed in a certain way to allow the habitat for the Searle bunting to survive. And there was money to allow this to happen. But as is often the case, there was a lot of paperwork when you were applying for this money. So one of the best things that the officer in charge did to get this all working was go to the landowners and say, listen, there's this pot of money here available for you to help this bird, but there's a lot of paperwork. So I'm offering that I will do the paperwork for you, and all you have to do is get the money and do the habitat. That's all you have to do. I'll do all the paperwork. And that really worked, because a lot of landowners then said, yeah, that's great. You do that for me. I'll take the money and do that. And that's what happened. And as a result, the numbers have been going up. And so sometimes conservation is less than practically actually managing the habitat or even saving the animal. Sometimes it's just volunteering to do the paperwork. And that can be enough to turn the fortunes of a bird around. This is the map for the distribution and the records. As you can see, they're scattered, but these are all current and historic records. So as you can see, Devon and the South Coast is your main bet to go to. And I have mentioned the Labrador Bay area for a good one to look for. If you really want to see them, I would go in winter, because we get an influx of wintering birds from Europe, and that just makes your chances much higher of seeing them. Now, in brackets at the start of the talk, I said there were 4 brackets 5 buntings. The reason for that is that we also have the snow bunting. which isn't a bunting. It just gets the name because of the appearance, because of the beak, because of the black eye. It has similarities to the other buntings, but is not only in a different genus, it's in a different family of birds, linked to buntings, but not the same thing. I believe that they're called longspurs as the name. And the family is Calcaridae instead, mainly found in North America. So this is the North American version of the bunting, and possibly this is down to convergent evolution, that two different families have evolved the same body to do the same job. In the UK, we do have some breeding pairs of snow buntings, but as you can imagine, as a whole, the species is much more northernly distributed in the northern hemisphere, and therefore the only ones we have are in Scotland, in the Highlands, and there's about 60 pairs each year, so not very many. But if you were to go up into the Highlands and the right altitude, you could see these birds breeding. Having said that, there are records all around the country of snow buntings, because on migratory season, you can expect to find them around the coast anywhere in the UK. You can see them. I've seen them on shingle beaches in Norfolk. We've had them in Bolton on the hills, on the moorland behind Bolton. So you could see them nearly anywhere. And they are ground foragers, which is why they like beaches and they like moorland, because their habit is to be on the ground foraging for food. Another member in the same family is the Lapland bunting. And again, you can imagine where it's found. It's found much further north than Britain normally. And just like the snow bunting, it's one that can only be seen in winter, really, in the UK. We don't have any breeding here, but on migration, some will turn up around, Spurn in Yorkshire in the east is a great place to go, and around the coast, as you can see in this image here. The east coast is better than the west because that's where they're coming from. They're coming from the east and from Scandinavia, so they normally hit Yorkshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, east coast of Scotland. That's where to mainly go. But North Wales, Northwest, not doing bad. South Wales, and you could pick one up just about anywhere. Conservation-wise, as always with the bird group, the obvious ones I'm going to point you towards is the RSPB, the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology, and the Wildlife Trusts. If you support these charities, they all work in their own way to help buntings as a whole in the big picture of helping wildlife. And as always, the subscription offer is there. If you've got any friends who are interested in learning a bit more about what's on their doorstep, please send them in my direction and I can set them up as a monthly subscriber. Next week is going to be a talk on damselflies. I had to double check then. We're going to be looking at the damselflies of the UK, which is a really nice topic as we hope to move forward into slightly warmer days. Although in Bolton this week, it's been very, very cold, freezing in fact. So fingers crossed that will change. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.